Good afternoon, everyone that's joined us from the UK and EMEA, and good morning to everyone who has joined us from overseas. So we've got our monthly LinkedIn Live. I just can't believe how quick these go. It just feels like yesterday that we last spoke, Rick. But today we've got a really good topic, actually. And I think it's something that's been spoken about so much over the last sort of 10 years, really, especially since global has been expanding. But what really makes a great global payroll provider? But before we start, Rick, I just want you to introduce yourself to everyone I think everyone that joins us knows you, but just in case there is somebody that has joined us that doesn't know you, do you want to let everyone know who you are?
Sure. So Rick Hamill, founder and CEO of Helios. Helios is a full-service HCM and global payments platform. So global payroll, worker, contractor pay, but a full kind of experience from end to end, supporting companies how they manage their global payroll and global teams around the world in 125 plus countries. Prior to that, I founded two other companies. One was a pretty large EOR organization called Atlas, and then prior to that, I was head of HR and talent acquisition and payroll for a government contractor out of Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and Japan. So this is a topic that I've actually been in. I've been the customer. I've looked for payroll providers. As an employer of record, I had to figure out how to process payroll and manage compliance in each country. And then as Helios, making sure that we streamline that through automation. So I've been through the full cycle, Melanie, from the customer to the vendor, and then some, and actually trying to figure out best practices. And that's what we're here to talk about today.
So basically, I will say that you have got the T-shirt, you've been there, done it, and you've seen the good and the bad. So as always, it would be great to see who has joined us and what parts of the world that you come from. I think there's a slight issue with my app because the way that our software works, I have to use my phone and it's all complicated and wonderful. But if you do have any questions for Rick really loves these to be spontaneous, and Rick does literally answer any questions. So if you really want to test Rick, this is a good platform to do it. Actually, maybe I shouldn't have said that, Rick, because we'll just get some really random but if you do have any questions, please reach out to Rick. So Rick, come on then. So what are the key qualities that define a great global payroll provider?
Yeah, so I think the first answer to that is you need to have someone that really understands how to do payroll in that particular country. Expertise is so important. If global expansion or global payroll was easy, we wouldn't be in business, right? So you need to be able to have a partner that really understands the ins and outs of actually how to do payroll in that country, and also provide a true partnership to help educate yourselves on how to actually do payroll. So I'll give an example of that. If you are onboarding in a particular country, let's use the UK, and you've never run payroll there before, you're going to want to know what to do and what not to do when you're onboarding those particular employees, what information you need to gather to make sure that the employees are onboarded smoothly, and then what are the timelines, what are pay dates, when do you need to have information over, when funding needs to happen. If that payroll provider can't give you the basic information of actually how to do business in that particular country, it actually sets yourself up for failure from a compliance perspective and also an employee experience perspective. So fundamentally understanding how to do business in a particular country. The second thing is the technology. I remember when I got into global payroll initially, and I'm going to date myself when I say this, but this is almost 20 years ago, when global payroll was Excel files and emails. So we have definitely changed from that era to where we're at today. But technology is so important, how you're actually gathering information. We live in a remote world. A lot of organizations have hybrid worlds. But how you get information into a platform to ensure that how you get to your payroll provider is going to be really important. So their technology is going to be key. One, you want to make sure it's compliant with local rules and regulations from a data protection perspective. Two, you want to make sure it's an easy experience for your employees if they need to do it from an onboarding perspective. And three, you need to be able to have a point of view where you can actually view, validate, and accept or approve what information is going into that system so that you can process your payroll. So their technology It's another thing that's quite important in the age that we live in today. The last thing is, there's a difference between technology and service, and we know that. But you want to have a partner who truly is a partner to you. Technology is really important, and automation is really important, and that gives you a lot more autonomy. But you want a partner that's not going to just take whatever you put into the system. You want a partner that's going to validate that information and ask questions and challenge you to make sure you're doing things the right way. We're human. We do make mistakes. So if you fat finger, for example, $10,000 versus $1,000, you want that system or that partner to be able to say, hey, this is a flag. Is this correct, to validate it so that you're not having to redo payroll or accidentally overpay an employee. So that partnership, that partner who's really going to be there to help you through that process, help you set up and make sure that you're doing things the right way is important. And the last thing I'll say, Melanie, is a partner that takes on some of that liability as well. A partner that says in their contract that you're fully responsible for everything, they're not responsible for anything, that tells me that there's an opportunity that they're going to be making mistakes. So there's a partner that's willing to say, hey, if we make the mistake, we'll take responsibility for that, really shows that they're a really good partner from that. So you really got to look at those kind of 4 components, and when you're looking at the best provider partner in that particular country.
So are there a lot of people, are there a lot of organizations in your experience that do share the risk?
Yeah, there are. It's not as common, but there are. And I think there's a reason why, because they're going to have certain SLAs in place. They're going to have certain quality control process and procedures in place to validate information. And they're confident in their systems to say, hey, we're going to provide everything we can do to validate this information. And then we're going to make sure we process with the information that we got accordingly. So there are those, but there are those who maybe made it, outsourced to third parties or fourth parties in some cases that don't want to take on that risk. And I think that's a red flag for you. What partner, you don't want to have someone that's just an aggregator who just sends information out, right? There are aggregators that are really good because they validate it, they support you. You don't have to always contact the local provider that they're using, but you want someone that says, look, we're going to partner with you, validate with you, and make sure it's done correctly in this partnership to make sure you're setting yourself up for success. There are a couple out there, not all.
Yeah, okay. So one of the key things that we do talk about quite a lot on our LinkedIn lives is compliance. So compliance is like the key topic, I think, especially with our members. It's one of the things that does keep them up awake at night. So how can you ensure that the global payroll providers are keeping on top of the compliance, and what do they generally do? Especially, obviously, it's multi-country. It could even be over multi-regions, Asia, Europe, the States. So what should they be doing?
Yeah, I'll say there's never a 100% bulletproof process from a compliance perspective, because the rules and regulations in countries change on a daily basis in some cases. But you want to have a provider that has the right processes and procedures to validate that information. They want to make sure that they're up to date. And typically that comes with certifications, right? You look at what your actual, like an ISO certification, what processes and procedures that you have internally that allow you to make sure that you're validating that information. You also like to ask them, how are they sourcing or verifying that information? In some cases, they partner with local law firms. They have partnerships with tax authorities in those particular countries as well. And so being able to validate with them how they actually look at that information, when they update and when they notify the customer of that, and the SLAs they have in place to communicate that to the customer is really important. Compliance is, again, it's not a perfect science, but you want to make sure that you have ways that you can be proactive. And I think the best partner that you're going to work with is the one that's going to be very proactive in that approach to make sure that you are up to date within your system, process, and procedures and calculations.
So it looks like my technology all of a sudden just came alive. So hopefully everyone's getting this okay on LinkedIn. Hi, Chanel, from a rainy West Yorkshire. So I know you're over in the States, aren't you, Rick? So we're still obsessed in the UK with our terrible weather.
Well,
But thanks.
we must be getting UK weather because it's storming here in Chicago right now.
Oh, okay, so we have nothing to moan about. So Chanel, I'm sorry, it's everywhere. It's not just us. So one of the other key things, obviously, you've got technology, and technology obviously is really important. But one of the things that we discussed a few years back, and it's still an issue, is the customer support side. And it's a really difficult one because some of the providers out there are very technology led, and they don't discuss the customer support. But then we speak to the members, and then that's some of the issue, is that they feel like they're just one of a number, or it takes ages to hear back from some of the providers. So how important is customer support, and what should, as you're looking for a new provider or from your current provider, what sort of level of customer support should you expect?
Well, I think here's the thing. I think technology is really important, right? There's a lot of ways that you can automate. You don't want to be incumbent to your provider where you have to always email them, you always have to call them, you always have to provide a ticket. So I think good technology is proactive, where it can think about what are the most common questions that are asked from customers. How do you get that information readily available to them? How do you leverage your technology to be able to support your customers? You can never get rid of the human interaction, especially in HR and payroll. That's always still really important. But I think there are tools that you can leverage, like FAQs, like AI, like analytics, reporting, training, that you can leverage within technology that will allow you to process payroll and understand how you do that from that perspective. Now, service, I think, is really important. You need to make sure that when you document with your SLAs, what is considered a immediate action, 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, et cetera, et cetera. But you do, but I think it's setting that expectation up front through an SLA process with your provider, making sure they understand what that means. So the biggest challenge that I've seen in the past was, I'm based in North America and I have an issue in China. I find out about that issue when I wake up in the morning, but they're already closed for the day. I'm always going to be delayed because of the time difference. So if I have to depend on an individual behind that, that's just going to delay the process. It's not going to give the employee a good experience if there's an issue with the payroll. So I have to figure out through technology that I can communicate. Either I'm going to stay up late, or I'm going to expect them to wake up early, which is not necessarily good for work-life balance, but also not a lot of organizations are not going to do that. They're not going to wake up really early to support you from that perspective. So you leveraging technology is going to allow you to be able to support that. But your SLAs is what I would say you would document with your providers. Ask what is going to be a level 1, 2, and 3, and then make sure you're setting your expectations behind that, and then asking how you can leverage their technology, again, their AI, their chatbots, and how their support, and how they can support you in those particular countries when there's a different time, the time zone difference, and their overall requirements.
So we've got a comment from Kevin. So thanks, Kevin. Customer service levels can be so varied across different providers and countries. There's some great ones, though, who share a lot of information and support you, especially when you don't have the local knowledge yourself.
Yeah. And I think the one thing is also, depending on where you are, culturally, service expectations are very different. So we've seen very different service levels from North America to Europe, and Europe to Asia, and what those expectations are. So companies who have a global payroll solution that's over multiple countries, they've got to figure out how to balance that out. And what we've done here at Helios is we've built regional hubs that we can support customers from a tech or customer service support perspective. So if a customer needs to get on a call, that can be triaged between a level 1 and level 3 kind of SLA. We can do that through our 3 hubs around the world, which will support the major time zones. Outside of that, we've also built our technology that every time we get asked a question, we filter that into our AI, so that when our clients ask questions about a particular country, or we're going through our beta testing right now, but when they're asking those particular questions, we're actually putting them into our AI with the answers and the steps, so that as we can continue to build out that AI, so when clients ask questions, they can actually leverage the technology to do that as well. So we have the human component, but we also have the technology that we're continuing to build on and expand to be able to provide support wherever the client's at.
And actually, one of the interesting points you made is the time zone difference, because obviously we both work in a global industry, and your day can start from sort of 6:30 till 10, 11 o'clock at night. Do you think sometimes when you're new into the global payroll arena and you're looking for a payroll provider, that is sometimes an element that's lost in the process?
Yeah, I think there's, from a customer perspective, we're normally working in our own time zone. So what's interesting that you typically find, we did a lot of research on this actually. The sales process is one thing, and a sales rep is going to be in any time zone that you need because they want to get the deal done. So you're used to fast responses. You're used to this amazing, experience during the sales process. And then you go into operations and you're like, wait, why is it taking 48 hours to hear back? I used to hear back within minutes, regardless of where the sales rep was at. It's how do you bridge that together and set proper expectations? I think it's really important in communication, the SLAs, as I mentioned before. But time zones, typically, a lot of individuals tend to want to make sure that they're supported in their time zone. So what you'll find is, okay, I'm doing business in, for example, India, but do I have an account manager that's going to support me during my business hours because that's when I'm working? Those are the questions that you would ask. Typically, a global payroll provider or a solution like a Helios, we would have an account manager in your time zone and then operation support that's supporting them in the back end in their time zone. That's how we would work, but there's other ways to do that. Sometimes they'll actually have multiple shifts to be able to support you wherever they're located as well. But again, it gets back to the SLAs and the expectations you set up front when you're actually going out to providers, asking them how you're going to support, and again, triaging what is a level 1, 2, and 3 inquiry for you, and when you're going to get back to me on that from that particular standpoint.
So I was traveling a few months ago, and actually whilst we were running sessions, we spoke a lot about data security, and actually while we were discussing that, there was a big breach within the UK government, and it's happening all around the world. So what should you be considering when you're looking at a global payroll provider, when you're looking at the data privacy side of things and the data security? Is there anything in particular that you think actually you really need to be focusing on this, or the payroll provider should be adhering to a certain policy? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I would recommend. I'm really big into RFPs. I think it's a really big process when you're choosing a payroll provider, especially over multiple countries, having an RFP process allows you to kind of look at a number of providers and making sure you're getting all your questions answered consistently. What I would ask in that process is, what certifications do you have? What are your process and procedures? What are your backups? What's your disaster recovery policies? And then I would also ask, and we actually recommend this for all of our customers or any of our prospects, we can provide a pen testing report. So how often are we doing pen testing? How secure are we making our system? So that you can understand the level of scrutiny that we put on ourselves and expectations from that perspective. Now, there are providers who are not going to provide that or don't do that. But I think if you're really thinking about security, data management, data protection, you're going to want to get that information to make sure that they have the right process and procedures in place. The question that we have today is not if someone, when someone's going to get, if someone's going to get breached. It's when. Unfortunately, everyone's getting hacked these days. So what are you doing in place to protect data? And I think that's important, that you understand their process and procedures, and even the notification to you. When do they need to notify you so that you can notify your employees as well if that does happen? But making sure that they have the proper process and procedures in place to ensure that they're fully compliant with those rules and regulations in those particular countries or regions. And then also, again, the certification processes, not just, are you certified or have you been certified? Is, are you being recertified? Have you been recertified? What's this process look like? And getting copies of all that information.
And so is it like a responsibility of the provider, but really a big responsibility for yourself and your internal processes to ensure that you're prepared for when?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the provider's responsibility to make sure that the data is protected, but it's also your responsibility to understand if something does happen, what your responsibility is from there. So communicating with your provider what their policy is and their recommendations for you, and then implementing that. I think when you're going through an RFP process or when you're looking for a new provider, making sure you also bring the right people to the table and asking those questions. Payroll is obviously important there, HR is important, but you definitely want to bring someone from your risk and compliance team, someone from your IT team, or someone from tech that really can help you ask the right questions to that provider to make sure you're doing it the right way. And that's why, again, getting back to the RFP process, I think it's so important because you can leverage them by putting all the questions that they would have. And then you can send out to a number of providers and they can help you kind of rate those providers to make sure they're doing it correctly as well.
With regards to the RFP process, would you suggest that a payroll leader or whoever's in charge of the RFP from the company, that they should get external resource or an expert, RFP expert, to start that process to help with the RFP?
It really depends on the size of the organization. If they're used to doing RFPs, I don't recommend that. But I do think that for smaller organizations, they can leverage feedback and say, hey, what should we be asking? What should we look for? What have you heard about this particular provider in the marketplace as well? So they can be part of that conversation. But it's really important that they probably put an internal committee in place from different stakeholders within the organization to put all their questions together, to build out that RFP, to then go out to those providers to get that information and to then rate them accordingly.
And do you know what? I do have to agree with you there. I think it's really important for the payroll community to talk to each other when they're looking at different providers, but also when you're talking to the payroll community, have a bit of understanding about the payroll leader's company background, payroll size, and everything else, because it's easy to hear some of the negatives as well as the positives, but sometimes you have to break down the negatives and why they're negative. But I do think it's a resource that we really should be using.
Yeah, I think also understanding as well. I think what I've seen in the past where what can be viewed as a negative could be, oh, they didn't do this for me. Well, what was the reason why they didn't do that? Was it not compliant? I had a couple of clients in the past who said, oh, we want to pay our employees in Argentina in US dollars. Well, the local employment law says you can't do that. I understand that they can be contractors and be paid in US dollars, but in regards to a currency, a legal requirement, and that was not a good experience for the customer, but it was not an issue on our end. It was the legal component of that. And we were trying to make sure we kept the client compliant. And sometimes being compliant means you have to say no. So diving a little bit deeper into that, I think is really important to understand why. And then when someone says, well, it's because we want to keep you compliant, here's the rules and regulations in that country for that. Again, someone can interpret that as a bad experience, but it really was probably a better experience for the business as a whole to make sure they were doing things right.
Especially if you want to stay compliant, which is what I've just said, it keeps everyone awake at night. You want your provider to ensure that, don't you? So thank you, Jackie, for your question. Our biggest challenge, or your comment, our biggest challenge is as a global payroll team, we want to standardize our global processes, which is very difficult, while working at different in-country providers across the globe.
Well, Jackie, I can say that's exactly why we built Helios, for that very reason. We found that actually doing payroll around the world it's not as simplistic as everyone says. It's not completely standardized. But what we did find is about 80% of global payroll around the world is standardized. What we've built for is that a standard process, but the additional 20% delta, so that you can have a really unified experience for employees and then still have that localized feel to make sure you're doing things the right way. So there are systems out there like a Helios that can support you from that, and how you actually can consolidate all of your countries to one provider, one solution, and still have consistency and standardization, but where you need to have localization is really important. I use a term called glocal, meaning global but local. You need to have that within your payroll because you want, from a compliance perspective, but also from an employee experience. I'm not sure, Jackie, where you're at, but using an example, if you were onboarding yourself in a particular country and you were missing certain documents, or there's certain terminology that you're used to seeing with all your former employers, and in a system you're missing that piece, you're going to say something's wrong, something's off, and you're not going to have confidence in that platform or that provider. So what we were focusing on is localizing to make sure that it's standard, but also local, and it gives that confidence to employees from an experience perspective, and avoids a lot of the back and forth, which you're probably experiencing with having so many different providers around the world. So that's actually why we built it. I was in your same shoes years ago, and I saw that this was a need and a niche in the marketplace, and I wanted to make sure we did that investment, given that I had that experience as well.
Actually, that's a really good point as well. We've run surveys over the last few years about how many ICPs that people deal with. So they're global payroll, but they have ICPs, and I think we've had some with over 100 different ICPs, and that's a huge process. So it sort of leads me on to the next question, really. So we've spoken also a lot about employer of record. So if you're expanding, they're a good resource to use to get you into a new country quickly. And as we all know, payroll providers are sometimes the last people to find out when a person has been recruited in a troubled country. So if you know that you're going to be expanding and you are using a global payroll provider and not an employer of record, what should people keep in mind, or what questions should people be asking to ensure that the provider can keep up with a growing organization?
Yeah. So here's how I believe that. I think, and you're right, that never happens, right? When a CEO comes to your office as an HR or payroll person and say, "Hey, we just hired someone in Japan, get them paid." I've been there. I had to figure it out, and I remember one time calling my payroll provider and said, "I can't find the drop down for Japan." They're like, "We don't do Japanese payroll." So having to go through that process is definitely something I'm very used to. But what I would recommend is, one thing that we've built out is the autonomy in our platform, where a client can add a country very simplistically, and there's a workflow where they have all the information they need to provide. Very quickly, a client will be able to see, do they have everything to onboard an employee in that particular country? Meaning, am I completely registered in a particular country? Do I have all the documentation? Have I registered for the pensions if they're required in that particular country? It's really important that an organization needs to know what it takes to onboard an employee in a given country. Just registering an entity does not do that. In many countries, you have to register for Social Security or pensions. In some cases, you have to have benefits in place for certain employees. And so it's really just understanding that checklist, what you need to have in place. And then you can pivot and make decisions. As you just said, sometimes as HR professionals, we're the last ones to find out. So someone's already been hired. There's a contract that may or may not have gone out yet. Someone's been made a promise, and you want to make sure that employee has a really good experience. So understanding what that checklist is going to be important. The second piece is, if you don't have everything that you need, what's your plan B? And leveraging what you just mentioned as well, an employer of record can be that. And so having a partner that can do both is really important from that perspective, because you can then leverage an employer of record temporarily, finish the registrations that you may need, and then transfer that employee over to your entity without creating a really bad experience for the employee. So having that leveraging that one partner to do that, which is what we talked about before from that journey perspective, but having a partner that really can handhold you through that entire journey, help you make sure that you're compliant, and help you understand what you need to have in place. I'll give an example. I just speaking to a prospect the other day, and they came to me and said, "Look, I worked with a payroll provider. We're not really happy with them at this particular moment. And it's not that they're not processing payroll. What they're not doing is doing it fully compliantly. They did not tell us that we had to register for these particular things." And an employee came back and said, after the second payroll, said, "Hey, I'm missing these deductions. These are tax deductions I'm used to. My paycheck is too high." Now, most employees won't always complain about their paychecks being too high. But what you'll find is that when employees notice something's not done right, they're going to immediately come to you, and it's going to create a bad experience for them, and they're going to have less confidence in you. So having a payroll provider that can make sure that you're doing things the right way up front and asking the right questions and making sure you know what you need to provide is going to be really key for your success in that market.
So one of the things that actually happened today in our membership was that somebody asked for an additional report, and the provider came back asking, I think the general consensus within the group was a huge amount of money for the report. So obviously going into working with a global payroll provider, you will need ad hoc things, you will need reports. How do you, I know obviously, I think you might say back to the RFP, but are there any tricks or any tips that you would give somebody to ensure that you have a pretty good idea of what's going to be charged, and to save the embarrassment of actually having to go to your CFO and just say we want this change and it's going to cost us this amount of thousands?
Yeah, I think a transparent contract is key. You're right; it's part of the RFP process, but asking upfront. And one thing that we recommend is a fee sheet, so it's clear. Like if it's not on this fee sheet, it doesn't exist. And so if there's something, and a lot of in the fee sheet's going to be a lot of what ifs, like what if scenarios. Um, and again, it's not always a 100%, but it's going to get you close to it as much as possible. But it can outline what that is. So you can ask for clarity to pull any hidden fees that are in the MSA or SOWs and say, if it's not here or the SOW, we're not going to cover it. There's some languages that a provider may put in place that says, if you're asking for something customized, we have to quote it at that point. But basic, if it's a report, typically they will say, we're going to charge you by the hour, or we're going to charge you a flat fee for that if we're going to do a custom report. I will say that if you're leveraging a platform that doesn't have a report writer in 2024, it's probably not the best system. You need to, right now we live in a world where you can customize a lot of reports and everything's a data field. And so you should be able to pull that out of the system very easily. So you may want to also validate that during your process, because again, 2024, it should be a simple report writer that any payroll provider or HR or HCM platform should be able to produce for you from today.
And is there, to put you on the spot now, Rick, is there any off that people are surprised about the most, that surprises you that people are surprised about?
Yeah, so off cycles are probably the one that comes out like, oh, what, I didn't have to pay for another off cycle. Like, well, it's outside of the scope. Our scope is XYZ. There's an off cycle. Reports I've seen, we don't charge for custom reports, but I've seen other organizations that they do, and I think that's one that surprises them, especially for something that's pretty simplistic to get. Another one I would say that offboarding fees, so they call them joiners and leaver fees. A lot of organizations are shocked about that, but they don't understand the reason why they are charged. They're charged because there's work to be done to offboard an employee. That's above and beyond just standard payroll processing. But those are probably the three big ones that I hear about the most. I'm sorry, and your typical implementation fees to set up a payroll in a particular country, to do it correctly. Typically, there's an implementation fee. Organizations are typically a little shocked about that, but when you explain what work has to be done to get that in place, then they typically understand it. But those are probably the top four.
Another topic that's been spoken about is discrepancies and errors in payroll. So I was in having a discussion a couple of weeks ago, and it could be an error from from HR. Actually, I should say payroll, but HR, or it could be an error from managers in retail, or all sorts of different reasons. How should payroll providers deal with that, especially if you're on a global basis? Or is it that the payroll leader or team need to get their house sorted out? What should the payroll provider do, and what should the payroll team do? I feel really awkward asking that question, but hopefully you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask you, Melanie, to rephrase that a little bit, because I'm a little bit confused with the question. But do you mind just kind of rephrasing that just a little bit for me?
There's two questions in one. So, how should a payroll provider handle discrepancies and errors in payroll? And then on the other side, how should the payroll team leader deal with the discrepancies?
So I think there needs to be a validation process within the payroll side. I think that there's a flow, and again, I don't think it needs to be a 2 or 4-eyed process. I think technology can leverage that from that perspective. I don't think when an organization approves payroll, it's done, right? There's always something that needs to be validated. I'll give an example. You go into a country where expenses have to be grossed up versus actually be paid out just as is. There's a validation process behind that. You need to make sure you understand the supporting documentation that came with that expense and to then gross it up accordingly. So I think when someone does submit something, the payroll provider needs to flag it within the platform if there's a discrepancy according to the client needs to see it. And anything needs to be readily available. I think I would love to show that one day here of how we're doing that, where it's just very clear, hey, this is an issue, please take action on that. I think the client also needs to understand, I've seen other organizations say, look, we're going to approve payroll, but the final approval needs to have another person look at it. And we're good with that. We can do that within our systems. But typically it's a 2 or 4 eye verification on the customer side. Typically it's a systematic process, like using AI or other tools to be able to validate that information. And then there's typically a 2 eye validation after that done in the system as well. So I think it just depends on kind of what you're looking at and what type of validation it is. If it's a fat finger validation, I think that payroll should be able to take a look at what was last time or what you've done with like if you're doing bonuses, have you ever paid $1 million bonus out? Have you ever paid a $10,000 bonus out? And then come back and say, is this a flag? If they've done it before, it's not something that gets flagged, it gets pushed through. So just really, I think you can leverage technology and humans to do that. But I think typically the client needs to have a 2-eyed approach, a 4-eyed approach on that. And then the system from a payroll perspective needs to have a technology and a visual view from that as well.
Well, Rick, I always like a bit of positivity. So thank you, Jenny. You're getting loads of insights from this session. And we always do with Rick. So so thank you for joining us. And all the way from the Philippines. I'm sure it should be it's pretty late in the Philippines, I feel like, at the moment. I feel like you should be in bed. But anyway, I'm glad you're watching. So there's so much, isn't there, going on in global payroll. And I feel like the last 2 or 3 years have been pretty mad, pretty exciting, push the payroll industry forward because of obviously COVID. But what trends are you seeing for the global payroll industry and with the vendors? Can I ask, is it just AI or is there more to it?
So I'm going to say something very controversial. So forgive me when I say this. I think AI is overused in a lot of marketing right now. I think AI is not just a chatbot, and I think that there's a lot more opportunity that organizations can, especially payroll, can leverage AI. I jokingly say this all the time. I want AI to do my laundry. I want it to, wash my clothes. I want to do all the work that I don't want to do. I want all the administrative work that I don't want to do. So when I think about AI within payroll, I think there's much more that it can be done than you see in the marketplace. I'm not going to give a lot of secrets of what we're doing here, but you'll see in the future what we're doing here at Helios with AI. But I think that what organizations can do is look at AI and how you can streamline and automate so payroll can be more strategic, HR can be more strategic in the conversation and not worry about the administrative work. And a lot of that is actually how they're actually managing teams. One of the biggest trends that we've seen in global payroll is volumes in certain countries are not as big as they used to be. And that's because organizations are hiring talent in different countries. So before, and I'm going to just make up some numbers here, an employer may have had 50 employees in Spain and maybe 50 employees in the UK. Now you're seeing, well, they'll have 20 employees in Spain, 20 employees in Portugal, 5 employees in the UK, 10 employees in Ireland. So they'll spread it out. So they have more payroll. Volumes hasn't necessarily changed, but they'll have more payroll countries, and they spread that out because they've seen that employees want to work remotely and they want to work wherever they are if they're not going to have a hybrid or an office setting from that perspective. We're also seeing that because they're going into countries they're not necessarily familiar with, they're having more need for service and understanding the rules and regulations of those countries. And so your technology has to evolve to be able to support that need. When you build technology, or what I like to call a painkiller, you're building a painkiller to solve a problem, right? And so because you're going to more countries, you're adding remote teams, you're looking at what that's going to look like from that perspective. So I think those are some of the things that we're seeing more and more of. Another thing that I will also see is that organizations want more autonomy within their platforms, not necessarily having to always call somebody. So they want to be able to add an employee. They want to be able to add countries themselves. They want to be able to make changes without having to call someone. So that autonomy is becoming more and more prevalent and more of a requirement versus what we've typically seen historically within global payroll.
So, with all of this going on, we're coming towards the end of today's session, but how should businesses go about evaluating and comparing different payroll providers?
Well, I think that just really, I think asking the tough questions, I think are really important, and then also giving scenarios. There's a lot of things that organizations are finding um, with within the organization. We're using certain providers today. So I would say, where were your pain points in the past, and how were they resolved? Did you like that how they resolved or how they were not resolved? And then ask through an RFP process or how you're sourcing your providers, ask them that scenario. This is what happened. How would you resolve this for us? And see if that worked for your business, or if they have the solutions behind that to help mitigate that or streamline that a little better. So asking scenarios are a really big question suggestion I have for when you're going through an RFP process. Another one is, don't just speak with one or two. I typically say speak between 3 to 5 providers. And then again, when you get any type of references, most providers are going to provide their best references. I always say ask for references that where customers may have had an issue and how you resolve that issue. And that's what I want to hear about. I don't want to hear about the perfect scenario. I want to hear about where there was an issue in a particular country and how you were able to partner with that organization to actually set them up for success. So those are some of the scenarios that I would probably recommend from that perspective.
One of the things that we discussed a lot, actually, and it's always amazed me when I have spoken to some salespeople within the global payroll providers, is that when they have their initial conversation or their first few conversations, that payroll isn't within that meeting. So they're looking for a new payroll provider, but they don't have the payroll leader at the table at the first meeting. A, do you think they should be at the first meeting? And B, how, as a payroll leader, how would you suggest you get to be there?
Yeah, I think it's really important that payroll is at the table. I've made this comment before where I believe payroll has to be probably its own department now. I think just the direction the world's going and businesses are going, payroll could be its own department. But how do you make a decision on a payroll provider without having the individuals who are actually doing the work at the table and providing feedback? So I think it's really important to do that. How you do that is showing how you can be very strategic, bringing resources and data points to help the business understand why you need to be at the table is going to be important, and how you can help leverage that decision and impact that overall decision on the providers that you have, not just by actually processing payroll, but actually showing what systems, what you're looking for, what's trending in the marketplace right now, and how you can actually be successful in providing that during that overall process. So just making sure that you're showing your value and showing your strategic initiative and how you can support the business from that perspective.
Yeah, sorry. So this is from Lindsay, and unfortunately, I hear about this so often. So Lindsay was at one job. I was informed of our new payroll provider, excuse me, instead of being included in the decision. Unfortunately, Lindsay, you're definitely not the only person. And we were running a course, actually, it's a certificate, and it's to help payroll leaders find a provider, all the things that you need to go through from the RFP. And we had a really lovely payroll leader on the course. She was really invested in the course. She'd gone out for lunch, came back, but really upset, and was like, "What's wrong?" And she's like, "They've just signed up with a payroll provider." So, and they haven't included her. So unfortunately, I think it's going to take a while, but we can turn it around. And unfortunately, it's not you're the only person. But
So
on a positive.
there's one comment from Martin on here. I just want to make sure you adjust. He said, wasn't always the case. That's nothing new. I also want to you're right, Martin, you're absolutely right. But the issue that it's not been resolved. Right. So when we're talking about scenarios like this and what's trending and what customers want, those are things that have not necessarily been resolved in the marketplace. And I think that's what we have to continue to talk about to figure out how to do it. We talk about a painkiller, is what I mentioned earlier. That painkiller, it's still there. That pain is still there, and customers are constantly talking about. We just did a survey with a couple other analyst groups out there, and that was one of the things that has constantly come up, and I think that's what we're trying to figure out is how do we resolve that. So I think your next comment says in 30 years I've never seen that. That is true, right? And that is what we have to figure out how to solve, right? The problem, the biggest painkiller out there, and I think that's what we're going to constantly have to talk about is this is still a problem, and how do we resolve that? I think that's what we have to constantly look at. So you're absolutely right. It's nothing new, but it is a trend that's becoming more and more prevalent given the world that we live in and with remote work. So I want to make sure I didn't miss a comment when we were going through this scenario. So Melanie, my apologies for interrupting you.
No, that's good. Obviously we're coming to an end for today's discussion, and thank you so much for everyone that has got involved. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with today, like any sort of key hints you think or tips, like, you know, if you are looking for a payroll provider, really ensure you need to do blah blah blah?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's sad when you hear, you know, payroll are never involved in that. I think it's really important that you vocalize that very quickly. A lot of it's because payroll tends to be looked into HR, and HR is the one making the decision. So making sure when you're having your one-on-ones with your leadership team, or if you're having, you hear that there's a process going in place, ask to be involved in that. I think that's going to be really important. I'm happy to, if anyone wants to reach out, you can definitely connect me with me on LinkedIn. I have a number of questions that I highly recommend when I consult with organizations for their RFP process and what questions they should be asking. And I think that's something that I can help you with if you have any questions. I love my passion is helping people. So if you would like to have questions or like to see if I can help you kind of walk through that scenario, there's no cost to that. It's really just making sure that you get the right support to make sure you're finding the right providers. And then another thing is that if anyone wants to demo Helios, we are actually launching our newest product actually coming out at the end of third quarter. We're happy to actually sit down with you guys and kind of walk you through that process if you guys are interested in looking at kind of what we've built and what we think is revolutionizing global workforce and payroll management in 125 countries. So happy to have that conversation with you guys if anyone's interested at that point as well.
Yeah, and I know firsthand, if you message Rick, he will get in touch and come back to you. So if you do need any help, then I think Rick's one of the best people in the industry to help on payroll and HR. And it's really exciting. You know, let's see the Helios software soon, hopefully, Rick.
Yeah, we're demoing already for anyone else to see it, but we are launching at the end of third quarter.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. And we'll see you again next month. If you've got any questions, feel free to message me or Rick. And we'd also like to hear from you of anything that you'd like us to talk about. So maybe we should do one on how to elevate the payroll profile within an organization at some point. But anyway, I'm going to shut up and let everyone get on with their work. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Rick. And we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you all.